Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Ahern. I'm coming to you today from Massachusetts in the United States of America, and I'm so proud to be presenting here at Rett UK. And let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about some of the social and emotional factors that impact communication in Rett syndrome. So specifically, we're going to talk about emotional factors, anxiety, apraxia, and a teeny bit about quote unquote behavior. So again, I'm Kate Ahern. I have a master's in science and special education. I've been working for over 20 years with individuals with complex communication needs and well over 10 years with individuals with Rett syndrome. I currently am a consultant and I'm running an online school for AAC users. During COVID, we do have one student who is from the UK in our online school, which is really exciting. If you're looking for information, you can go to my website, which is aacvoices.org. So the framework of this is the idea of social and emotional learning. So this is sort of a hot thing right now, social and emotional learning, and adding social and emotional learning to the curriculum has been happening across the United States and around the world. So this is the process where we actually teach students how to apply knowledge, attitudes, and skills so that they can manage their feelings, have positive goals, show empathy, have positive relationships, and make responsible choices. So this is a whole framework that is out there that you can look into. And if you're looking for information on specifically teaching some of these things to your child, you can search within the field of social and emotional learning to find some lesson plans and so forth that you can adapt to work with your own child. But some of the things we work on in social and emotional learning is self-awareness. So knowing yourself, knowing about yourself, knowing how you react to things, knowing how you handle things, so that you can then take your knowledge and use it to make your life better. Self-management, the ability to, stop yourself before you get too distressed or too upset, the ability to think about what's going to happen if you handle things a certain way. Responsible decision making, which is fairly obvious, but thinking about if you're going to make a choice, what choice is going to have the best result in the end. Relationship with skills, and that really ties into communication. And then social awareness, knowing how others around you are feeling and what is happening in the social environment. I don't think our girls are lacking in any of these things. It just provides us a framework for, girls, women, boys, men. I don't think any of our individuals with Rett syndrome lack in any of these things. It's just a framework that schools are using to think about social and emotional things. That's, I think, is helping us rethink about the idea of, you know, kids are being naughty or kids are being resistant or kids are not participating because they're being bratty or because they have an attitude. It helps us rethink maybe kids need more skills. Kids do better when they know better, and if we give them the skills they'll do better. And this applies to all kids, including people with Rett syndrome, and frankly all adults including people with Rett syndrome. So one of the things I do want to mention is behavior. So I'm not really talking about quote unquote behavior today. I don't think that it is as popular in the UK as it is in the States, but here applied behavior analysis is really the thing everybody turns to. And within the world of ABA, we define behavior as observable and measurable actions, excluding physiological events. However, in my experience, and this is just me and what I've seen, ABA is a field, and there are some individuals this doesn't apply to, but overall, they do not understand Rett syndrome and some of its hallmark traits. If I had to tell you the number of times I've argued with ABA specialists about hand wringing or clapping in Rett, they always insist that there is a behavior, it's a behavior and something is reinforcing it. But you and I and everybody who works in the world of Rett syndrome knows that this is neurologically driven. There's no control over it. They can't necessarily stop it. Well, they can certainly, if they're calm, it may decrease. And certainly they can ask for splints or assistance. But we know that these hand movements are hallmark traits, and it's genetic. It's just going to happen. Um, and I think that, many other symptoms or hallmarks of Rett syndrome are just as misunderstood. I find that ABA doesn't necessarily understand apraxia, which I'll talk about in a minute. I find that they don't understand breath holding and teeth grinding, and they see all of these things as observable and measurable and not physiological. And we know that genetically, these are genetically driven physiological events, and that, well, we can help our individuals sort of understand them and work within the confines of their own Rett syndrome and maybe calm them a little when they're calm. We can't extinguish these things. And I think a lot of harm can be done if somebody approaches a child or an adult with Rett syndrome with the idea that they can extinguish behavior. I certainly have seen a number of individuals who, ABA was really great at helping with some things, but really did a lot of damage in terms of these things that aren't behavior, quote unquote behavior, because they're physiological. So I'm going to sort of stay away from talking about behavior. I am going to ask, though, that we rethink how we phrase when we're talking about behaviors that are typically called negative or challenging or problem behaviors. Instead of saying non-compliant or challenging or problem behavior, I'm going to use the word distressed behavior. A child who's being non-compliant or challenging or having a problem behaving is usually distressed. Maybe not in that moment for some of them, but certainly nobody does those things because they feel fantastic. I'm going to call what some people call attention-seeking behavior support seeking if that behavior is about getting relief or help. So if a child is or an adult is having significant anxiety and they're doing things to get the quote unquote attention of a caregiver or support person, I'm not going to say that they're being attention seeking because it's not about attention, it's about support. They need support in dealing with their distress and their anxiety. And when somebody is having quote unquote attention seeking behavior that is more about getting a connection, because the child needs to have a connection with a secure person for reassurance and comfort, then we're going to call that connection seeking. We're going to think of individuals as seeking what they need and using strategies that typically work for them to get those needs met. And that's probably the most I'll say about behavior right there. We're also going to remember that all behavior is communication. I'm sure you've all heard this a million times, but all behavior, quote unquote behavior. So remember, I'm not counting these physiological things like breath holding and teeth grinding and our hand movements and those sorts of things. I'm talking about things like not being willing to participate in a lesson. That is telling us something, that is communicating. Typically, it is the child telling us that either it's too easy or it's too hard, or they are not physiologically in a position to do the work right now. But individuals with Rett syndrome are just like everybody else, and sometimes we don't want to do the work. Sometimes we are not feeling it. We're not feeling like work is a thing that we're into right now. So we have to remember that that is in play too. We have to remember that all children and adults with Rett syndrome are children and adults first, and that they may well be saying what any other child or adult would say: I don't want to do this, I don't like this, no thank you. We just need to remember our job is to figure out what is being said and to teach the most efficient, effective, and safest way to say it in another way. Now, what do I mean by safe? Well, we know that some individuals with Rett syndrome um, may hit themselves in the head, bite their hands. They don't necessarily have control over those behaviors, but they escalate in times of anxiety or stress or anger or intense feelings. So we can teach kids how to identify those earlier and hopefully not get to the point where they're screaming or biting or throwing things or that sort of thing. And we're also going to look for teaching communication in a way that doesn't increase the already high risk of abuse as it applies to people with disabilities. And I'm going to tell a personal story here about why I feel this is so important. So I had a sister, and she had a brain injury. She did not have Rett syndrome. She had a brain injury, and she was in rehab after the brain injury. She was unable to speak at that time, but she was able to scream. And she was just relearning how to hold her bladder and use the bathroom. And one night in the middle of the night, she woke up and she needed to use the bathroom, and she rang for a nurse, and the nurse came in and shut off the call light and left. And then she pressed the button again, shut up the call light and left. And then she started screaming. Now, she really didn't have any other choices at this point. She didn't want to have an accident. She wasn't getting the appropriate care by pressing the button. So there was already abuse happening. But because she screamed so often and she spent so much time screaming at that point in her recovery, when the nurse, or it was actually a nurse's aide, returned to her room, she slapped her across the face and physically abused her. So I know that one of the things that we hear when somebody abuses a person with a disability is how people excuse that behavior because there aren't enough supports and it's a hard job. And the person to blame for abuse is always the person doing the abusing. But we can certainly take great pains to abuse proof our kids as much as possible. And one of the ways to do that is to help them communicate in a way that doesn't increase the risk of abuse. If we are able to teach skills to self regulate and self calm, then it's less likely that the agitation of the individual will set off a person who may hurt them. Now, again, it's not, if that happens, that is not the individual with disability's fault in any way, shape, or form. But when I think about my sister and I think about what could I have done to help her not have that happen to her, I think we could have helped her a little bit with doing other things besides scream at that point and getting better from her brain injury. And so I think about that a lot with my clients. And of course, 20 plus years in this field, I've heard some really upsetting stories about things happening to kids. So abuse proofing kids is one of the things that I like to think about. How can we help them as they grow and learn to be able to advocate for themselves, to be able to control their own emotions in a way that makes them feel safer and makes them be safer in the world. All right, so off of that soapbox, let's talk about apraxia. So apraxia or dyspraxia is an inability to perform a functional motor movement. Touch this, reach for that, even move your eyes around. It's any movement that you mean to do that has a purpose. So it's the inability to have a purposeful movement. And that's despite the fact that the individual understands what they're being asked to do or understands what they want to do or have to do. So you're telling them, touch this, pull this, do that. The message doesn't pass properly from the brain to that part of the body. It's despite the fact that they want to make the movement. They want to do that. They want to, reach for it or look at or whatever you're asking them to do. Just the message isn't getting through, despite the fact that they have the physical skills. I think we've all seen an individual with Rett syndrome brush off a mosquito, maybe, or have a movement that's completely unintentional. That unintentional movement isn't as apraxic or apraxic at all because it isn't on purpose. Apraxia affects on purpose movements and it's neurologically based. So, again, if somebody tries to tell you it's a behavior, then you really need to question, is it a behavior or is it apraxia? And this can kick up in a lot of different ways. So, one way that I see a lot in Rett syndrome that's very misunderstood is the human body is, we evolutionary wise are designed to avoid risk and danger. And one of the ways that we developed, back from the caveman days, is that when there is movement in an otherwise still environment, our eyes go to the movement. So you may have a child or an adult with Rett syndrome, and they're sitting by a window and they're staring at the window and not participating. And you think they're daydreaming or tired or, they don't want to do it. And the truth is that the part of their brain, that evolutionary process that tells your eyes to look at moving things, that is unintentional. So that happens without apraxia. But turning and looking on purpose, that happens with apraxia. So they might get stuck looking out the window because that part of their brain is in charge. And having a message saying, don't look at the window, look at your talker, or look at the teacher, or look at your mom, that's tough for them. So we can help prevent some of that by being thoughtful, moving somebody so that the window isn't going to distract them. And that's, when they need to be doing something that's important. Otherwise, look out the window. That's fantastic. Enjoy it. But, the same thing happens for TV and videos. If there's movement on that screen, it's going to be very hard for them to look away from that and look at something that's static, not because they don't want to, but because our brains are primed, our eyes are primed to look at something that's moving. Another example of this is how apraxia can tie in with weak motor skills. So, for example, if you have a child who wants to pick something up, if it's food, then the drive to get food is evolutionary wise very strong. So, picking up and grabbing food and getting it to your mouth, apraxia isn't as involved. Picking up a tool like a marker or anything else, that you have to think about doing. It's a functional motor movement that is, thoughtful. And so apraxia will kick in. So that's why sometimes you'll see a child who can pick up a piece of popcorn and put it in their mouth, but can't pick up a pen and hold it. The other thing to remember about motor skills is physically, and you can ask any OT about this, but physically it is much harder to pick something up than it is to let it go. So a lot of times girls with Rett who have some hand skills will pick things up and then throw them. And you'll think, oh, we have to stop that. We have to make them not do that, whatever. The truth is, it's really hard to let go of an object once you've picked it up if your motor skills aren't strong. And so the only way to get it out of your hands is to make a jerky movement that allows the object to be thrown out, as opposed to opening your fingers slowly and putting them down. So I see a lot of clients who, throwing is something being addressed, and they're not doing it on purpose. It's weak motor skills, and you can design the environment so that it's not as much of an issue. The next thing we're going to talk about is anxiety. Anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, unease. We all know what anxiety is. We've all been anxious at times. Usually it's about an event that's going to happen or something we're uncertain about. And you can see how in the life of somebody with Rett syndrome, imminent events happen all day long, and uncertain outcomes for some individuals more than other happen a lot too, especially with the way the world is right now. An anxiety disorder, which is different than just being anxious, is a nervous disorder that is excessive uneasiness and nervousness, and it's usually has some compulsive behavior or panic attacks. Now, behavior here is not the ABA word behavior; it's the field of psychiatry behavior, and it means things like biting your nails, or grinding your teeth, gritting your teeth, all the sorts of things that we see every human being who has an anxiety disorder, and some who don't do, and sometimes it's panic attacks. And I worry about a lot of our individuals with Rett syndrome that they are having some panic attacks, and those panic attacks are seen as behavioral meltdowns, or um, a tantrum or something like that. And they're not able to communicate to us what's actually happening. And for anybody who's actually had a panic attack, you feel like you're going to die. Like you can't breathe, the walls are closing in. It is horrifying. And so for an individual with Rett syndrome to experience that and not be able to communicate about it afterwards would be very upsetting to them, and is something we need to be thinking about. So I have this tool that I use for individuals with Rett syndrome that I'm going to have on my website for you to get. It'll be along with this slideshow at aacvoices.org. And I'm just going to switch to another app so that everybody can see the tool that I'm talking about here. So this is a tool that I designed in working with school systems and parents around what to do when an individual with Rett syndrome is off or is having more anxiety, or they're just not themselves. They're maybe their stereotypes are really, really high. Maybe they're unable to do things that they can normally do. So this is a list of things to think about when somebody with Rett syndrome is not themselves, and you're seeing like not positive changes in their affect or in their ability to participate. So the first thing, of course, is you always rule out illness and pain. I know a lot of individuals with Rett syndrome who have had significant issues medically and been in a lot of pain. And because Rett syndrome typically has a very high pain tolerance, things can get very bad before we realize they are in pain. I had a young lady who had a very inflamed gallbladder that was full of stones. And she advocated with her speech device for months and months and months, saying exactly where it hurt, how much it hurt. And the doctors wouldn't listen to her mom, until eventually she had to have emergency surgery and have her gallbladder out. And she was in significant pain and unable to communicate that. And I know of individuals with Rett syndrome who have broken bones that have gone a couple of days, even longer. So ruling out the pain is important. If there's a change in affect or ability to participate, then rule out that pain. The next thing we of course check is, are medications being taken as directed, or their medication changes. I know one family where mom and dad somehow got off kilter in their communication, and each was giving the same medication. And so the child was getting a double dose, and she was extremely sleepy and unable to participate, and our affect was very low. And once we sort of, not we, I wasn't actually part of this one, but once the family sat down and went through piece by piece what it could be, they figured out the problem. And then, of course, there's constipation. Oh, we all know in Rett syndrome how that goes. So always be thinking about that and the pain of constipation. And then, of course, the sleep issues. And we all know that nobody is in a good mood if they don't sleep. So then we've got a double whammy. Mom and dad are having a hard time. Siblings might be having a hard time. And then the individual with Rett syndrome is having a hard time. And then we move into things that aren't sort of as big of an issue or as ongoing of an issue. Things like, is there a schedule change that can really throw off somebody with anxiety? Are you missing somebody? I've had a student who, before every session, we have to make a list of everybody important to them and where they are, for him to feel safe to keep going with our session. Are there any other anxiety sources? Have people been arguing, siblings or parents? And this is normal as arguing is, it can be very anxiety provoking. Our primary caregivers tense about something, and I don't know about in the UK, but right now in the USA, everybody is tense. Holidays and events, even if they're good things, can be very stressful and provoke anxiety. Have there been changes in a caregiver schedule? Are you home more or less? Even if it's a good thing, it can cause anxiety. Um, and the other thing is sort of environmental things. So, like, we just changed the clocks over, and that can really throw off a lot of, especially people with sleep issues. New car, redecorating. Anything. I knew an individual who got very upset because her family threw out a plant, and it was a rubber tree plant that had always been in the house, and it wasn't, it had like flies in it, and it wasn't, so they got rid of it, and it took us weeks to figure out what the problem was. A growth spurt, so very hungry, sleeping more, aches and pains. Hormonal fluctuations as puberty begins and throughout puberty and, well, into life. Hormonal fluctuations can be a source of anxiety. Interactions with someone who isn't respectful. I'm going to talk more about this later, but a lot of individuals with Rett syndrome are very sensitive to not being respected and having their rights violated and aren't able to communicate it. One of the most frequent things that happens to me as a practitioner is once I get a child on a communication system and they know I'm there and I'm going to listen and I'm not going anywhere and I'm a safe person for them, they frequently start telling me about things like being ignored or being stared at, or I have one individual, I maybe worked with her for half an hour before she told me a whole long story of how in her family, well, I didn't know it was her family. I didn't know her at all, so I didn't know what she was talking about. But a whole story of how a brother had a girlfriend who was having a baby, and the grandparents were really mean, and they said mean things. And she told me all of this, and I wrote it all down like it was a journal entry. First time I ever met her, and it turned out she was actually telling a true story. Her brother's girlfriend was pregnant, and they were a couple, and they were going ahead with having the baby. And her parents, who she lived with, the grandparents of the baby, were very anxious about that. And this young lady, as soon as she had sort of the tools to sit down and tell me all this, she did. So sort of knowing that that stuff might be brewing in there and need to be talked about. We need to think about triggers from any other previous trauma, any sort of transitions, unexpected presence of a known person. So what I mean by that is, if you show up at school and you're not expected at school, that can really cause anxiety. Why are you there? What's happening? This is different. It's wrong. And then a presence of a stranger, of course, same thing. And then sometimes we need to think about our weekends. Sunday night is a transition before going back to work on Monday. And a lot of individuals with Rett syndrome and a lot of individuals without Rett syndrome have a hard time on Sunday night. It's hard to get, switch that transition from weekend to back to school is very anxiety provoking. Parties and get togethers can provoke anxiety, even though, maybe they're awesome. They can totally make somebody anxious. Again, changes in schedules, seeing people, visitors, going to new places, special events and special outings, doctors, dentists, medical visits, all of that you need to think about. And then the next part of this checklist is how your son or daughter or person you work with demonstrates anxiety, or to reframe it, uses skills they have to relieve their anxiety. So, for example, increased need for eye contact is they're trying to relieve their anxiety by connecting with you. So that isn't it's a positive skill that they're using. They should be proud of themselves that they can do that. But we're going to look for all of these things in terms of how does your individual demonstrate anxiety, and then you're going to add on other things that how you tell that the individual is anxious. And then this is a good thing to check back on periodically and say, you know what, there, when she puts her head down, is she anxious or is she tired? How do you tell? um if the child's refusing to eat, if this, they're not sleeping at all, and for kids who have more mobility, are they, flopping or dropping to the, I like to call it pulling a Gandhi, dropping to the floor and making their bones into spaghetti? If they have aggression, self-injury, has that increased? And then remembering some caregiver strategies. So in times of high anxiety, a one at a time rule can be very helpful. A lot of times when somebody becomes very distressed, every adult tries to jump in and help. And then you have two, three, four, five adults trying to help, and it's actually making it much worse because it increases overstimulation. There's mixed messages of what to do. One person is saying to get deep breath, the other person is giving, saying, do this. Another person might be, have a tougher stance and say, pull it together. So one caregiver at a time, and then you can tag in and tag out. The adult working to calm the child can tag out to another adult if they're beginning to feel distressed themselves or they think they're not able to help. And this is really helpful because that means that you are being aware of yourself and you know when to step out. And other adults have to request to tag in before they try to help. In a school team, there should be, of course, one overall person who is running the show if you have to do something like this. But at home, you can get really good at this one at a time, tag in, tag out, a system that really can help diffuse things by not having it be as overwhelming. And of course, decrease auditory and sensory stimulation, slow down your speech, speak quietly and calmly, maybe don't speak at all. And then if it's a situation where a power struggle could be happening, you want her to do this, you want him to do this, they're not able to or don't want to, nobody wins in a power struggle. So maybe, use some humor, deflect the situation, take a break, do what you need to do so that it doesn't end up being adversarial at all. Because if there's one thing that makes apraxia and anxiety worse, it's if things get adversarial. So that anxiety checklist is there on my website for you. You can certainly add to it. It's a PDF, but you can, use an app or a program on your computer to type onto it to add other stuff. You can, change it up and have it added to an IEP. And you should be very specific about what sorts of ways does your child or individual show anxiety. And then these tools can help with that. All right. So one of the things I like to say about apraxia, we always like to joke, is if you want a person with Rett to talk to you, walk away. And it sounds counterintuitive, but individuals with Rett are highly social and usually highly social. I'm not everybody, of course, but mostly highly social, and they're usually very attached to the caregivers in their lives and the people they care about. But if we sit and stare at them and ask them demanding questions or confrontational questions, they're probably not going to be able to respond. Even sitting face to face as opposed to side by side or kitty corner from each other is going to increase that on the spot feeling. And that's going to increase the anxiety, which is going to increase the apraxia. And then you're going to get a lot less communication. So the best way to get communication from someone with Rett syndrome is not literally to walk away, but to be both of you be engaged in another activity while you're talking, to have a focus on something other than communicating, to sometimes to set it up so you are sort of away from them. I know a lot of individuals with Rett syndrome who like to sit in the kitchen while somebody's cooking, and there's no pressure on them in that moment. The caregiver's back is often turned because they're cooking, but that's when the individual talks the most, because there's no pressure on them to do it, and that decreases anxiety and decreases apraxia. And what I like to tell people in training is you want to be conspiratorial, not confrontational. So you want it to be like you and that individual are in on something together, as opposed to you're confronting them and asking them to communicate. If you can be conspiratorial, like it's you and them together, you're going to get a lot more communication and a much decreased anxiety. And then, of course, along with that, hopefully decreased apraxia. And another word, let me just go back to apraxia for a minute. Another thing that can override apraxia is intense emotion, specifically anger or excitement. So if an individual is very excited, they may be able to do something physically or with their device that they normally are unable to do on demand. And the same is true for when they're angry. For some of individuals with Rett syndrome who have a little bit of preserved speech, excitement and anger, that's when their language pops out, their verbal language pops out. And even for individuals using a talker, that's also when sometimes we see a lot more language from their devices when they're excited or when they're angry, because that can override the apraxia and they are more able to do those things. All right. So another thing I want to talk about is this idea of a secure base. So this is from attachment theory. And attachment theory is this idea that very young children, they form a connection, a relationship with one or more primary caregivers. And that person, through their attachment with the child, is able to help them feel safe. So it's where the child turns when they're safe, when they're feeling unsafe or upset or anxious. When kids can trust that there's a person they can turn to, no matter what, they can turn to that person and they will be calm and they will create safety, then anxiety is decreased. And then they're able to explore their world. The idea that there's a safe place to go back to, or a soft place to land, if you will, is what allows them to go out and try new things. Now, this also applies to individuals with Rett syndrome, and frankly, probably everybody, at most ages, which is this idea that when we feel insecure, that we turn back to the people that we know are safe for us. And that's one of the reasons I think we see such intense eye contact in individuals with Rett syndrome when they're having a harder time. And they'll stare at you and their eyes say it all, is because that is their connection, right? So that secure base, their ability to reach back and feel safe, their connection is through eye contact. And even teeny babies use eye contact. Like you'll see a small child, I'm sure you've seen like a toddler fall down and they look at their parent. And if their parent is like, ha ha ha, ha, you're fine, the child's fine. And the parent's like, oh my God, you fell. And the child's crying and screaming. That is all about using the secure base to feel safe. If the person who's your secure base models back to you that you are not safe, then even if you are, your reaction is going to be that you're unsafe. So one of the things that teachers and parents and caregivers have to do is they have to think about being that secure base. So the next two images I'm going to show you are from the Providing a Secure Base program, which is meant for like foster care and adoption and kids who are in like congregate care, group home sort of settings. And their idea of the secure base has these 5 aspects to it: that the caregiver has to be available, that the caregiver has to be sensitive and able to help the child manage their feelings, that the caregiver has to accept the child for who they are in order for the child to accept themselves and build self-esteem, that the caregiver has to cooperate in helping the child. They have to let the child take the lead so that they can learn how to master this for themselves. And then whoever the caregiver is, whether it be in a family or somewhere else, they have to help the child feel like they belong. Now, I'm sure when we think about all of these things, we can think about how they apply to the child in front of us, right? So is somebody available to them at school and at home who's able to give them this secure base? Because if we're able to do that, anxiety will decrease. When it increases, they'll return back to the secure base and be able to be calmed somewhat. And then we'll be able to teach them the skills to do that for themselves over time. And then there's this cycle. Throughout the development of a child, the child has their needs, and behavior is being used here as on-purpose actions, not there are lots of different definitions of behavior. So we have the child's needs and how they try to get those needs met, which they're calling behavior. And then you have how the caregiver thinks and feels, which goes into how the caregiver behaves, which changes how the child thinks and feels, which changes how what they need and how they behave. So this circle of the child impacting the caregiver and the caregiver impacting the child, and us remembering that we set the tone. That as the caregivers, we set the tone that we can help the child change how they think and feel. And if we do that, we can help them better meet their own needs. And that means as they become older, they'll be more participatory in their worlds, they'll have broader relationships. Life will go better for them if we've been able to do this as they've grown. All right, so one of the things that is really important as we're doing all of this is that AAC must always be available. If we are going to teach individuals who are prone to anxiety and who have apraxia that using their language matters, that it can help them, that both talking to others and talking to themselves about what is going on is how to make their worlds better, then we darn well better make sure that their AAC is always there. We cannot expect them to request their AAC when they're distressed. It has to already be there so that before they're distressed, they can learn how to say what they need to say and not end up distressed in the first place. We also have to remember that because so many individuals have eye gaze systems now, there has to be a non-electronic option available that includes a way to ask for their electronic AAC. And that system has to be robust. It can't be 20 messages total. It needs to be a system where they can say whatever they need to say to whoever they need to say it. You can't say that you're stressed out because you overheard your sister saying that, she and her friend are going to a concert and they're going to be there out late and, you're anxious about that. You can't say that if you only have 20 words. And if you can't talk about what's bothering you, you can't get help to understand it and feel better. So this is really vital, full and robust AAC all the time. All right, so let's talk about some tools. So we've talked about anxiety and how that impacts apraxia and apraxia and how that impacts communication. And we've talked about that kids are kids and, adults are adults, and we're all going to have all of the normal broad range of reactions and emotions and everything that everybody has. But what can we do to help individuals with Rett syndrome, with apraxia and anxiety, help them better function in the world and help them learn how to keep their world feeling safe for them so that they can learn to read and write, and they can make friends, and they can hang out, and they can go out in the world. So, what are some of the things we can do? Well, first, I want to say that an excellent framework for how we should be treating individuals who need a communication system, including individuals with Rett syndrome, is the Communication Bill of Rights. So, this was created by the National Joint Committee for Communication and ASHA, which is the American Speech and Hearing Association. This is an adaptation of theirs. So, the actual Bill of Rights from them is written at a college level, and very detailed in how professionals should be viewing the rights of AAC users. I made this version and I brought it down to a third grade level so I could use it as a teaching tool with all of my clients. But when we look at what's here, it teaches us what AAC users need to really grow as human beings and to feel that they have autonomy and respect, and give them more of a secure base so that they can learn to be out in the world. So some of these things are, the right to pick my own friends and have a social life. Just because some kid is picked to be in Lunch Punch doesn't mean that that's the best, choice for a friend for your child. Your child should get to pick who their friends are, along with the other kids that they hang out with. The right to ask for what we need and who we need and where to go. We always have the right to say no. No, don't touch me. Don't touch my Toby. Don't stand behind me. No, I don't want to do this work right now. I don't want to eat. Now, just because you say no doesn't mean that you get to have the final answer be no. That's not what that says. It's the right to say no. And we have to be responsible for saying, I heard you say no. I understand you don't want to do this, but you have to eat because that's what keeps you healthy. Whereas if they're saying, no, I don't want to wear the purple socks, then okay, what socks do you want to wear? They have the right to say what they feel. And this is huge. If we're going to teach all of the things that I have coming up in these slides, the right to say what I feel comes first. And it's the right to say what you feel without worrying about that if you're sad, it'll make mom sad, or your teacher sad, or you'll hurt somebody's feelings. The right to make real choices, not pretend choices, but real age appropriate choices. So if you're, 3, the red sweater or the blue sweater is a real choice. If you're 13, the red sweater or the blue sweater, yes, you need to be deciding what you wear, but it shouldn't be just sweater colors. You need to have choices over your clothing and so much more by the time you're 13. The right to say what we think, the right to know about our world, to get and give information, to know what's on the schedule, to say what's next 10,000 times. I have a young lady I work with who every single session she says to me, how long? And I tell her how long we're going to work. And then she looks at the clock. And then when we're approaching the time we're going to end, she gets very excited. And the minute it becomes that time, like the minute it's an analog clock, the minute the big hand hits the 12, she's out of there. She stands up and leaves. And she has a right to ask that. The right to know about the people in their life and everything happening to them. Not just to have a new teacher aide appear one day and be expected to let that person, control your world and take you to the bathroom and feed you, but the right to know a little bit about them ahead of time. The right to be taught to communicate and to have what I need. No communication devices on a shelf. No, I forgot my book. And no, we showed it to her once and she couldn't use it, so we're only going to give her 5 words. The right to have my system and have it be working and to have people who know how to use it. The right to be heard and answered even if I can't have what I want. Just like any other person, right? So you have a 5-year-old who says, I want to go to bed right now. I hear you. You don't want to go to bed right now. But guess what? It's bedtime. And even as an adult, I don't want this appointment to be at 11 o'clock. I need it to be at 11:15. Oh, we don't have appointments at 11:15. They're on the hour. Okay, then. But that right to be heard and responded to, not just ignored. The right to be part of a community, the right to be treated with respect. I mean, so obvious, but so often not done. The right to be talked to and not about. I don't know how often this happens in the course of a day, probably hundreds of times to individuals who use communication systems where people have conversations about them right in front of them. It's so disrespectful. No wonder we get anxiety when we've just heard our whole life discussed right in front of us without having any input. Um, and then lastly, the right to be talked with in a way I understand, right? So sometimes for individuals with Rett syndrome, that means you're going to model on their device to help them understand, to add a visual component, um, those sorts of things. And that leads right into receptive language. So, as I've said a whole bunch of time, kids with Rett syndrome are kids first, adults with Rett syndrome are adults first. Remember that just because we presume potential and we believe in the intellect of our individuals with Rett syndrome in front of us doesn't mean that you can talk to a 4-year-old like a 12-year-old. Doesn't mean that you can talk to a 12-year-old like an adult. That we have to be sure that we're communicating using clear and understandable language for that individual. And then again, we come back to this rate of speech. Young kids, and I would say anybody having an anxiety attack, really need us to bring our speech down to 140 words per minute. But the average rate of speech is 220. So if you're talking to a child under the age of 5 or 6, you need to be slowing down your speech. If you want to know what that should sound like, Mr. Rogers on the Mr. Rogers show used to talk at about 140 words per minute. And think about how calming it was to watch him because his rate was slowed down. Then we also have to consider auditory processing challenges. When your body is moving all over the place, or your body won't move when you want it to, it takes attention away from using your skills to listen. So that can make it tough. A child may miss what you're saying because their body is moving or they're jumping up out of their chair, even though that's not really what they meant to do. So consider the auditory processing piece as well. We need time to process information. All of us do. And the younger you are, or the more complex the information is, compared to what your skills are, the more processing time. Finally, modeling language on their AAC system helps us as communication partners slow down, and it adds a visual component. So if you're having trouble with 140 words per minute, then that's an excellent time to model because it will slow you down. And then using visual supports. So we have something visual in addition to something auditory. I'm not going to talk too much about sensory needs because I know that there are entire other sessions during Rett UK about this. But we know that individuals with Rett syndrome can have some difficulties with sensory input, whether too much or too little. You should be working with your OT to figure out if you need a sensory diet. You should have lots of sensory choices to increase or decrease sensory input, like weighted blankets and whatever else is going to help your child, maybe ear blocking headphones, those sorts of things. And then you need to make sure that there are messages on the AAC system to say, I'm dysregulated, I need my weighted blanket. And, that language should match the age of the child. But those are the sorts of things that it's important to be able to ask for if we want kids to be able to learn how to manage their own sensory state and their own emotional state. So visual supports, something that I don't think we use enough in the world right now for a lot of our individuals with various disabilities is visual supports. They provide information or direction visually. So some of the ones here are one show and then all done for some of our individuals who really like their videos. Or a child who tends to lean back to stand up instead of leaning forward. You can have the visual for nose over toes to stand up. You have to lean forward to stand up and push into your legs. And then ask for help before you are upset. When you start to feel upset is when to say, I need some help, not once you're already in a full sort of state of inconsolable upset. So we can use these as teaching tools. So showing them, talking about them, and teaching them. They can serve as a reminder. They should be very specific, not just like be good, be nice. Those aren't terribly helpful in terms of visual supports. And we have to teach them and then model them and then reinforce them. So, we say, okay, we're learning about asking for help before we're upset. Here's a visual we're going to use to remind us. And then we watch. And when a child's starting to get upset, we say, oh, you know what? It looks like you're getting upset. We've been talking about asking for help before you're upset. Let's ask for help now. And then you say, oh, you got some help and you didn't get very upset. Great job. That's the sort of thing we can use visual supports to do. Visual schedules are another thing. If you have a child who gets very anxious about what's going to happen when, visual schedules can be very helpful. They can show a sequence of events, and it can be part of a day, a whole day. It can be anything in between. It can be just the steps of a task. So that timer that you see there, that was for a student I worked with who had trouble leaving at the end of the day. He didn't like to go home. He was not a child with Rett syndrome, but he didn't like to go home. And he would drag out leaving forever. And he'd always be the last kid down to the bus. It was really rough. So we made him this with a timer, and he was amazing. He'd do all the steps by himself and be ready to go. And then, a whole day. Here's what we're going to do today. You're going to get up. You're going to have a Zoom class. We're going to have a snack. You're going to have another Zoom class, because that's how life is right now. We're going to go for a walk. We're going to play a game. We're going to have dinner. We're going to brush our teeth. We're going to take a bath. We're going to go to bed, so that we know what's coming. And you can use a calendar or a timer, whatever you need to augment the visual schedule. And then you should use the visual schedule to model talking about the past, present, and future. So at the end of the day, when you're resetting the schedule, you can say, look at all the things we did today. And then you can model on their communication system how to talk about something in the past tense. One of the things that happens to all individuals who use AAC, but specifically to individuals with Rett syndrome, because they have so much trouble with access and apraxia, is they're limited to the here and now, because they're not given the language to tell us when they're talking about something that already happened or something that's going to happen. So using the visual schedule in the morning to say this will happen and show them on their talker, this is how you say it will happen. And then at the end of the day, say, oh, this already happened. We did this before. That can really help them build their linguistic knowledge, and then hopefully learn the skills to use their communication system to tell us these things. To say, oh, at school today, I did X, Y, Z. So you might have a child who says cake, 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 and you have no idea, do they want cake? We always assume it's a request, right? And a lot of time it isn't. They're not saying I want cake. They're saying I had cake, or next week we're going to a birthday party and there's going to be cake, or there was a cake on TV. But unless we teach the language to differentiate, then everybody's going to assume that the talker is a requesting machine, and they're not going to be able to fully express themselves. So using visual schedules in that way can be extremely helpful. Another thing we really need to think about is emotional identification. So this is the ability to identify feelings in ourselves and then later in other people. We might need to do specific instruction on how to match what we feel in our bodies to feeling words. Remember, the physical experience of somebody with Rett syndrome differs from somebody without Rett syndrome, right? So when they're feeling anxious, they may not bite their nails and, start to act distant or whatever a typical person without Rett syndrome does, but they may, have increased hand wringing, or their teeth grinding may get really bad, or they may, have lean into somebody to lean on them for connection. So what we can do is we can start to watch them and describe them, use descriptive feedback, or verbal referencing is what Gail Porter calls it, and she's the inventor of the POG communication system. Use descriptive feedback to say, you're jumping, you're smiling, you're holding your hands out. You feel excited, or your hand wringing is happening a lot more, and you're holding your breath and you're frowning. I think that maybe you're worried. So that we can start to have them identify in themselves, this is what my body is doing. And that helps me understand how I'm feeling. And then we also have to model this for kids about ourselves. So in class, if something happens that frustrates me, so maybe screen share doesn't work properly, because it is Zoom classes at this point, I'll say, oh, I am getting frustrated. I feel my body tensing up, and I feel my eyebrows going down. I'm very frustrated at what's happening. And then lots of times the kids will tell me what to do. They'll say, take a deep breath. Oh, okay. Oh, I feel better now. So doing that about yourself, and in the car is a great time to do this, because lots of emotions happen when we're driving. So we can say, I'm feeling angry because that person in front of us cut us off. It makes me mad. My muscles feel tight, and my voice got higher pitched, and I'm angry. I wonder what I should do. I think that I'm going to think about something I like. So really showing kids how you use these skills so that they can learn by watching you. And then doing the same thing with the child with the AAC system, so they can learn, how do I say, my muscles feel tight, I feel frustrated. So teaching that so that they're able to use it, because that's the first step to using strategies to help to calm ourselves, is to know how we're feeling. So one of the ways that we can start to teach strategies and teach emotional identification is using aided language displays. Now, this just means a communication board with or without pictures. It just means a tool for communicating. So this is an aided language display for a child for when they get very anxious. And this particular child gets anxious if they're bored, if they're scared, if it's too loud, if someone was mean, if they get too excited. They don't get anxious if they're too excited, but they might have other troubles if they're too excited. If it's too crowded, or if something is different or missing. Those are the things that would set this particular child off. And then the things that calmed this child was being alone, having squeezes or hugs, so deep pressure, music, and being given some space, which, is a little counterintuitive, because our desire with most kids when they're having a hard time is to go to them. But we were able to help this child understand that she seemed to do better if she was given some space. So this allowed us to have a tool, and we laminated it and had it so it could fold into pocket size, and it reflected what was on her device and in her book, so that we had this at all times, so that we could pull it out no matter where we were. So it was in addition to a communication system. It was not instead of. And get posters made. You can beam an electronic communication device up to an Apple TV or Chromecast. The design of an aided language display should be consistent with the AAC system. So the same symbol set, the same type of layout, same color coding. And you can create specific aided language displays for sort of positive behavior support and anxiety intervention. And this can help if a child is too overwhelmed to use their system. You can make this into sort of a list. So I have a number of individuals with Rett syndrome who have what we call go to the list. And the list is just a list of the things that typically cause them upset and the things that usually help. And the child at that point only needs to say yes and no, or even just yes. And we go through the list and they tell us yes or no. So they, I'm feeling, and they say, I'm mad. And what do you need? I need a break. So when they start to get too anxious, and they're so anxious that the apraxia is very severe, we go to this list with what's called a partner assisted scan. So the communication partner lists each item one at a time, and the child says yes or no. Now, it's very important that everybody use the same list in the same order. And the reason for this is you do not want to play 20 questions with a child or an adult who is very distressed. 20 questions is just going to upset them more. So using the list means that it will be predictable. It'll be the same order every time. They'll learn to anticipate when the thing that's bothering them comes on the list. And ultimately, primary caregivers are going to memorize the list. So if you're in the car and the individual starts to act distressed, you can start going through the list and look in the rear view mirror for their yes and no response. So, you can move from aided language displays to something like that after a lot of practice. So aided language displays can be super helpful. You can arrange them in a list for partner assisted scanning. If your child typically gets into a situation where they can't use their normal method of communicating because they're too anxious or upset. All right, so social stories. Social stories are a specific kind of writing, a story, and they were designed by a woman named Carol Gray many years ago, back when I was in college. So they're a story that's written in the first person, usually, sometimes third, never second. So it's not gonna say you. It's either gonna say I, or the child's name. So it's not gonna be sorry, I mixed it up. First or third person. It avoids assumptions. So we don't assume anything in a social story. It has a patient and respectful tone. And there are two kinds of sentences, descriptive and directive. Here's what this looks like. Here's what to do. There should be a ratio of 2 to 1 for descriptive to directive. So for every one directive sentence saying you should do this, there should be at least 2 descriptive sentences. The perspective is positive. There's no shaming or bad or don't. It's all here's what you should do, not what you shouldn't do. Half or more of your stories should be just celebrations of success. So not trying to teach a social skill, but just building positive self-esteem by having a success story. So what I'd like to do is I would like to share with you a bunch of social stories. So the app that I'm using here is not PowerPoint. I opened the wrong app. Is Pictello. So Pictello is about $20. It allows you to create these books. They're talking books that you can access on an iPad. You can also make this in PowerPoint or in Google Slides or anything like that and add sound. You can do it in your daughter's communication system and any of the page sets that let you write your own book. I do it in Pictello mainly so I can share things with other people. Pictello will allow you to save as a PDF. And sometimes I will take the images from the Pictello PDF and I will put them into a communication page set to make it so the book can be read on a communication device, on a Toby or, a grid pad or whatever somebody's using. So I have a bunch of stories here. And the story I want to share with you first is Boss of My Rett Syndrome. I read this to all of my clients with Rett syndrome, even if I only meet them once, which doesn't happen a whole lot, but I read them to all of it. This book has been around. I wrote it about 10 years ago. It's been around for a while. It's gone through many changes based on what people with Rett syndrome and with other disabilities have told me they found helpful or unhelpful. So it's been adapted. You may have picked up a version of it floating around on the web that was different. It used to be called Boss of My Rett Brain. We changed that from advice from some people with disabilities saying that that maybe wasn't the best wording. So this is the latest version. So what this is meant to do is, first of all, it's meant to let the individual with Rett syndrome know that just because their body doesn't do what they want doesn't make it so they're not smart. Second of all, it's meant to tell individuals with Rett syndrome what their symptoms are so they know why these things are happening. So many individuals with Rett syndrome have no idea that wringing their hands or clapping or their hand stereotypy is from Rett syndrome. They don't know that. And then people say things to them that imply they should control it. So they'll say, get your hands out of your mouth. Don't put your hands in your mouth. They can't help it. They're bringing their hands to midline. The mouth is at midline. It's a neurological genetic imperative that they bring their hands to midline. It's not a choice, but they get this mixed message that they should somehow control it. So having the symptoms there so that they understand it. And then it talks about how sometimes if you have something you really want to do, you can really focus your body and calm yourself and calm your Rett stereotypies so that you can do what you want for a little while. And not a long time, because we all know that's really outside of the realm of what we can ask. But for a minute, 2 minutes to take a deep breath, calm your body, and be able to focus enough to do something for a short amount of time. And then hopefully build that. So like I said, I've had remarkable responses when I read this to individuals with Rett syndrome. I read it to a young lady with Rett syndrome when she was 6 years old. And we read it the first time and she just watched it with this look of awe on her face. And we read it a second time. And in the book, it mentions all of the different stereotypies. And she did each one as it occurred in the book. And it was really adorable and showed she understood it. My recommendation for this is I certainly will have the code up on my website for you to download it. But the recommendation is that you take it and you customize it. So take out the symptoms that your daughter doesn't have, or your child doesn't have, your adult doesn't have, and add in anything that I missed. So here's the story. Boss of my Rett syndrome. It's going to say Rett brain because I haven't changed the recording, but boss of my Rett syndrome. I have Rett syndrome. Sometimes Rett syndrome is a real pain. Rett syndrome means that sometimes my Rett syndrome tells my body to do things. I am not always happy with what my Rett syndrome tells my body to do. Sometimes my Rett syndrome tells my hands to grab each other or twist, and you can change that to be clap or go in my mouth. Actually, the next page is go in my mouth. Especially if I have better things for my hands to do. Sometimes my Rett syndrome tells my hand to go in my mouth, even though my hand doesn't exactly taste good. Sometimes my Rett syndrome tells me to hold my breath or swallow air, even though that makes it hard to think and gives me a stomach ache. Sometimes my Rett syndrome tells my teeth to grind, even though it makes icky noises and hurts my jaw. Sometimes my Rett syndrome tells my body to have a seizure. That stinks. Let me be clear. I have a beautiful brain. My brain is beautiful and very smart. Rett syndrome does not stop me from being smart. But sometimes my Rett syndrome is very, very bossy. Sometimes I need to tell my Rett syndrome who is boss. I am boss. Maybe I can be boss of my Rett syndrome every minute, but when there is something important happening, I tell it. You listen, Rett syndrome. Stop it. I've got beautiful brain stuff to do. I'm the boss right now. Sometimes I might need a little help making the point to my Rett syndrome. I might need to wear my elbow splint or have somebody hold my hand. It's easier to be the boss of my Rett syndrome if I am calm. I can take deep breaths to calm down, breathe in and smell the frosting, breathe out and blow out the candles. And that is a breathing exercise I teach all the kids I work with. We pretend we have some cake, or we really get some cake. And then we breathe in to smell the frosting and breathe out to blow out the candle. If worrying is making my Rett syndrome extra bossy, I might tell it I might need to use my talker and share what I'm feeling. Letting people know what I'm nervous about can help my Rett syndrome knock it off. I can be in charge of my beautiful brain, my smart brain, and tell my Rett syndrome to let me do what I want. The more I practice, the better I will get at being the boss of my Rett syndrome. I have Rett syndrome. I am strong. I am smart. I am amazing. So that's one example of a social story. And then you can do some that are very specific. So this is Tessa's book about asking. This is from years ago. She's much older now. About asking for help before she's too upset. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it starts off with a positive statement. Most days I'm happy. I love my family, my school, my friends. Even though I'm happy, sometimes I get mad or upset. Yuck. Um, I can use my device or ask for my pod book. And then I can say something is wrong. I'm tired, grumpy, upset. I can go to categories, ask for music. And for Tessa, music is one of the things that helps her when she's upset. And then just a reminder, I can say that something is wrong. I can ask for what will help me. I'm a big girl. I don't need to scream, which is her specific behavior. Not behavior, you know what I mean. Her symptom of distress. And then you can do other ones. For example, this one is about getting casted for an AFO. So this would be something that you do for a specific situation. So you know you're going to get AFOs. You know that your child's going to get anxious because it's somewhere new and different and new things they're doing. So this explains exactly what's going to happen. You get pictures usually from the internet of the exact waiting room, go through all the steps of what's going to go on and what the sensations will feel like. It's going to be hot, the cast will get hard, and going through each of the parts of it so that the child knows what to expect, and doing that a lot. And then you have other books. You can do very simple books, what the child likes. So those are the sort of the positive celebratory books. Or, books about, I did a project, I did great at swimming class, those sorts of celebratory books. So those are a little taste of social stories. You can see here, this is from a little girl I work with named Kriti. And on her speech device, she has messages to help her self-regulate, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And one of them is, I'm the boss of my Rett syndrome brain. So she has the older version of the book. But she says that to herself. So she's talking to herself when she says that. So she said, I'm the boss of my Rett syndrome brain. And then she self-advocated and said to the person helping her, too many words, please slow down. So those kinds of messages, once we teach how to use them and model it, can really help decrease anxiety and stress and really just increase quality of life. So self-talk, which is what Kriti's screen just showed there, we all use self-talk. Now, some people don't have an internal monologue, but that is super rare. So most people use self-talk to regulate their emotions, right? So you catch yourself getting anxious or mad and you try to calm yourself down. Or, you think, this is too much right now. I'm frustrated. I'll do it later. So you use self-talk to get through hard times. You use it to motivate yourself, right? So if you're exercising, you say, oh God, I can do another 10 minutes. We use it to scold ourselves. Oh, don't do that. You're just going to have to fix it later. To explain things to yourself, right? So, maybe he's being a jerk because his he's having a fight with his wife and it's not about me. That help us with planning. Well, if I do this and then I do this, I'll have to go back. My favorite story with self-talk and planning is I did a East Coast, a bunch of Rett syndrome consults down in New Jersey, and I took the train from Massachusetts to New Jersey, which is a long train ride. And on the way back, I was exhausted. And somehow I got it in my head that it would be better for me to get off the train in Boston instead of 5 or 6 stops before, because I'd be closer to home. And luckily, my self talk kicked in at the last minute to remind myself that the reason I was supposed to get off 5 or 6 stops ahead was because that's where my car was. And if I went all the way to Boston, I would have been stranded, or would have had to figure out how to take a train back. So, self talk to help with planning, we all do it. It's not just about individuals using AAC. We all need to do that. We use it to remind ourselves of things, right? Oh, don't forget to do this, or oh, don't forget to take your medicine before you go, or that sort of thing. So we use it to work through fear and anxiety. It'll be okay. It'll be fine. I have a big dentist appointment tomorrow, so I'm telling myself a lot today, like it's no big deal. They're just doing the first step. It's a big surgery I'm going to be having, but it's multiple steps. We use it to manage pain. Like it hurts, but I'm okay. I can get through it. The Advil will kick in 20 minutes. So all of this self-talk stuff needs to be internalized. And some individuals with Rett syndrome who are able to have this sort of conversation have told me they do have an internal monologue in their brain. But one way we can help them build that is by having self-talk in their AAC system. So we can have specific self-talk messages to help them with various situations. So some of the things we need to do is we need to model self-talk. We need to directly teach how to use self-talk for multiple purposes. We need to make sure there's access to positive self-talk and self-talk for self-regulation. One of the cool things that's happening in my AAC school is that we've all worked on self-talk together as part of a class that I teach. And the kids have started to be able to tell each other self-talk messages that apply to the other child's situation. So for example, I have some, I had a child who was in distress. She was crying. She was really having a hard time. So I threw it back to her peers. What advice do you have for her? And her peers told her, take a deep breath, maybe listen to music, and really advocated for, here's the things you could do for yourself. And eventually she did, and she calmed down and she was fine. As you make these self-talk messages, that AAC users should really have some input on what it says. And the reminders should really make it clear that Rett syndrome doesn't impact their self-worth or their value. And you don't want to say Rett syndrome does not impact my value, but you want to have things that say I'm smart, I'm strong, I'm creative, I'm a problem solver. Messages that they help you pick, that can help them when things are dicey, or even they just need to be reminded. Sometimes they use them to cheer for themselves, right? So they get through a tough situation and they say, I'm creative. Yes, you are. Good job. You were creative. So here's Selena. I know her mom is doing a presentation at Rett UK. Here's her self-talk page. So Selena had input into all of these, and she was in the class that I teach where we talk about this. And she uses these. I've heard her say some of these things. I am capable is the one I've heard her say quite a bit. I am capable. I am brave. And, talking to herself to help her be in control when things are tough. And here's Kriti's page. So that's Kriti. So I can say, stop. I can do it. I can make good decisions. I can be safe. I can wait. I can be gentle. So these apply specifically to her, right? I can slow down. Kriti's body tends to get ahead of her. So sometimes she needs to give herself a minute for her brain to catch up. So here she said, say something important. I will, I am, I can. right? So, and that is a message she made for herself, reminding herself of how valuable she is and what she can do. And here's just a sample page at the bottom. You can see it has, I can be safe. And then it has, so it has the pink messages or saying what's wrong. And then, leave me alone. And the alarm noise, and then some messages, I can be safe, and breathe in, breathe out. This is a child who hits herself. All right. So self-regulation. For this, you're going to provide your child messages about their anxiety and their feelings. You're going to make sure there are messages about their specific triggers. I have a child I worked with who on Zoom, I've never met them in person, but we've been working together for 6 months now. And the child kept trying to get out of the chair and needed it unbuckled to get out. And I said, maybe there needs to be a button that's on the talker that says, let me out of my chair. I need to get up. And it changed everything in the dynamic of classes, because it turned out the child wanted to basically stand up and just sit on mom's lap, but he couldn't do that. So, when we added that to their pod system, they were able to do that. So we're going to model these, and we're going to have practice and in the moment, and we're going to honor the messages, even if they don't seem relevant. So if the child is saying, I can take deep breaths, we're going to say, all right, let's stop and take some deep breaths. So we're going to teach and model identifying emotions, as we already talked about, teach ways to self-regulate for different emotions. You do something different when you're scared versus angry. We're going to co-regulate. So we're going to help our child regulate if it's too hard to self-regulate at the moment. And we're going to have lots of self-regulation tools available and ways to ask for them. Right? So I'm not going to go through all these because I think it's just pretty much the same slide. It is. Oops. I feel annoyed. I made a mistake. All right, pre-teaching. So one of the things that we can really think about is if specific activities cause stress or quote unquote behaviors, we can really set out ahead of time to pinpoint what is upsetting, and then use tools like social stories and watching videos. There's videos about everything on, the dentist, the everything, a blood draw, whatever you need a video about, you can find a social story kind of video on YouTube for. And then teach about these things before they happen. So the picture I have here reminds me of the fact that we did not do a good job with Madison when we went to this event. We did a good job giving her, something to calm down the overstimulation, but we really should have done more to show her. We showed her a social story, provided this event was a sensory friendly Boston musical of Cinderella. But she had a really hard time, and we could have done a lot better. And I put it there to just say, we don't always get this right. So sometimes you need to build up to things. If I had that to do over for her, I would have wanted a visit to the venue ahead of. She lived 2 hours away from it, so it was hard. But I wish she had been able to visit the venue ahead of time to really see what it was. I wish we had shown her more videos of what it would look like. But use my experience of poor Madison getting distressed to help you remember to do these things. Again, with pre-teaching, sometimes there's unexpected anxiety, like ending up in the hospital. So if we can pre-teach ahead of time with that, but sometimes things happen and there's no time to set up for it ahead of time. So in those situations, you're going to remind your child to use the techniques that work. You're going to tell other people what your child needs a lot. You're going to watch your child for cues of rising anxiety and get in there early before it gets too bad. And you're going to remember to use that eye contact, secure base, calming words, visual support, sensory items, anything you've taught for anxiety reduction. You're going to do that in the situation. And you all know that. Every parent can figure that one out. So a little bit about media. So Madison, who you saw, had some significant issues around videos. And it was to the point where her screaming because she wanted a video was really ruining the quality of life at her house. Her parents were affected by it. Her brother was affected by it. They couldn't go anywhere. If they went somewhere, they had to have devices and battery packs so she could have her show on. At school, they were showing her videos. She was watching hours and hours of Blue's Clues and Mickey Mouse Clubhouse a day. And we really looked at eventually and said, we need to do something. It's out of control. This tool that originally calmed her has turned into the source of her stress. So it backfired. So showing her Mickey Mouse Clubhouse used to be the thing that made her feel good. And now it had to be constant or she felt awful. And the level of her distress was huge. So I did some research. And it turns out that a number of doctors really have looked at how tech can be a digital drug and can increase depression, anxiety, and aggression. And this is in typical kids, but I've definitely seen this in Rett syndrome, that it becomes their anxiety med. And it also becomes the point where if they feel any teeny amount of distress, they start whatever it is they do to get their shows on or their music on or whatever it is that they need. So the tough thing about this is part of you wants to say, let her have it, she's happy. But it turns out it can really ruin their lives. The danger is media becomes a constant need. It's the only tool in their toolbox for anxiety and boredom and anger. So because it's the only tool, it's what's always used. And you see Madison here, and she's at a Rett event, a Rett fundraiser, and you see she has her portable talker in front of her, but in front of that is a DVD player. And so she wasn't able to participate in this event that was, in a way honoring her because she was so hooked on her shows. And granted, that situation was anxiety provoking for her, and she needed a lot of supports to get through it. But she would have actually known what was happening around her if she had been able to not have her shows on. Another danger is the child is no longer a part of family activities. They can't enjoy things like going out to eat or sporting events because they have to have their shows. They miss opportunities for exploring and learning about the world. They miss out on literacy and numeracy instruction. Their siblings don't want to interact with them because they're still watching the same show every day. And sometimes if they're stuck on a show meant for younger kids, it creates a perception of intellectual impairment. So if you have a 22-year-old watching Blue's Clues, people who meet them aren't going to think, wow, that's a person who is totally capable in a body that isn't working. They're going to think that person has an intellectual impairment. And I don't like it either. And I'm not dictating, don't watch Blue's Clues at 22. They can watch whatever they want to watch. My point is that if it becomes a thing that has backfired, you need to intervene. And preferably, you need to not let it get that far. So, like I said, I did some research. And so this is just a funny thing you can look at another time, but we came up with a little quiz about how do you know if Rett syndrome is making it so videos and media is backfiring. So stuff like, if your child is older, is the main character of the show one of your longest relationships? Do you watch the show even when the kid's not in the room because it doesn't even register that it's on? Can the child calm down without their show? Can they eat without their show? Can they go to family events? Is school showing media during the day? Do they need it to go to sleep or to be in the car? Do you have to carry away for to watch their show or whatever it is that they need in terms of media? Are they unable to listen to you read a book? Is it a babysitter? So what I did is I did a little survey and I got 74 responses. So this was maybe 5 years ago. 80% were moms. They were ages 3 to 30 were the individuals with Rett, were their age range. And what I found out were 10% were watching media of some kind, passive media for 2+ hours a day. 60% of individuals watch the same thing repeatedly. Now, I'm not knocking that. I know lots of typical adults who watch the same show, NCIS seasons 1 through 17 on repeat. And that's okay. That's a good way to, in a way, it's a secure base. It's calming, it's familiar, you know what's going to happen. And that's why we find it calming. That's why we do it. The question is, has it become gone from something that helps to something that's harming? 45% refuse to watch new shows as they grow. So if you put something else on, they have a problem. And then when I asked what happens if they're denied access, it turned out that 30% have a significant negative response once or more per week, and 10% once or more a day. And those significant behaviors, let me go back. Sorry, hold on. Go back. So those significant behaviors range from, so like 26% are fine. You shut off their show, they're fine. Another 20% or so are annoyed, but they'll be okay. But then the rest, so another 50-ish percent, over 50%, have some sort of negative episode of distressed behavior when denied access to their show, right? So maybe they'll scream like Madison did. Maybe their stereotypies increase. Maybe they become very angry at the person and demonstrate their anger through however they do that. Maybe they become angry in general. Maybe they'll shut down and pretend to sleep or actually sleep, which of course, if your body doesn't let you do hitting and yelling and screaming, sleeping is the ultimate I'm not participating. Maybe they leave the room or try to get out of the room. Maybe they use assistive technology to get to the video anyway. And then I had a write-in, and the write-ins were really, really rough to read. They talked about self-injury, ruining TVs, knocking them down, trashing the space they're in, being very aggressive. So some very extreme responses to being denied access to the media of choice. And what were some contributing factors? Well, most of them had no other independent leisure skills except for something passive that was adult dependent. So they had nothing they could really do on their own. Parents would have the worst situations. Parents had an attitude of, as long as they're happy, they can watch 10 hours of Blue's Clues a day as long as they're not screaming. And of course, the flip side to that is they are really in severe distress when the show's not on. And the other piece was low expectations. Parents who expect their kids to learn to read and write and do math and participate in society don't typically get up to 12 hours a day of watching Blue's Clues. So those things combined contribute. Now, this is Tessa. Tessa likes her music to calm down, and we'll ask for it when she needs it, but it's not a requirement for her. But she can read, she can communicate, she has many, many interests. So that sort of helps buffer her from this media problem. And that's the goal. You want to prevent it from getting there. So what do you do to overcome this? Well, first of all, prevent it. Don't let your kid get to the point where they're watching multiple hours of the same show. Insist that if you're going to watch something as a family, they watch too. Shut the TV off. Turn the videos off. Make a rule that no videos at dinner. Make a rule that, no videos here or there. Set a very clear schedule and have lots of stuff to do. And yes, it's more work on you, but it will be so worth it once your child is able to do other things and you start to realize, like, we can go do stuff now. We can sit down as a family and play a game now because the media is not such an issue. So there's Madison, after a very intensive program of getting her past her Blue's Clues and Mickey Mouse Club addiction. So there she is doing some nails and stuff, something she never would have done before because she would have needed to be watching her show. You have to introduce those new activities. On the bottom screen, you can see a Google Home device and a Toby set up to activate it. So this young lady, we gave her the ability to put on her own music when she wanted. So we empowered her with a more active leisure activity as opposed to just watching videos. You want to use visual supports. You want to have those strict limits on when media is available. You want to encourage the whole family to participate and have community participation. You want to go out into the world. I mean, right now, maybe not, but as things change, here's an example of a young lady another reader who could read a book. She used a switch to turn the page and she had her eye gaze to talk about the book. You want to limit downtime because it's when boredom kicks in, is when the media stuff can kick up. If school is letting your kid watch video, step in, put it in the IEP that's not allowed. They're at school to learn. They're at school to be educated, to be taught to read and write and do math and have social skills. And none of that happens when you're watching a movie or TV. So none of that at school. The fastest way to know if the school is a quality school is to say, how often do you watch a movie? If they say every day or every Friday, nope, not happening. They only get 30 hours a week at school. Yes, they need breaks. Yes, they need things to relax. Those things should not be passive media like videos. Educational videos with activities around them, yes. Passive watching Blue's Clues or The Little Mermaid, no. You'll know that if you're going to try to cut down or eliminate this TV video media addiction in your family, it's going to get worse before it gets better. You're going to have a hard few days. But in most families who do it that I have heard back from or that I work with long term, it's only bad for less than a week. And then the child starts to realize, like, I can calm down without a video. I can be with my sister and play and not have a video playing. And quality of life will be better long term. The only other thing I want to mention is watch out for the relapses. One lazy aid, one tough week where everybody has the flu, you turn on and on all day, you're back at square one. So just be very careful. And that is all. So thank you all for watching this. No, I went a little bit over. I hope that that's okay. 8 minutes over. I believe I have a Q&A coming up that you'll be able to ask me questions at. The handouts and the anxiety checklist and the PDFs of the book, the social story, will be on my website. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at AAC Voices, except really I'm not. I have an account. I don't use them, so you have it, but I doubt I'll be there. On Facebook, my business is AAC Voices LLC. And if you need to contact me, you can do that through my website on the contact me form, or my email address is kate@aacvoices.org. So thank you all very, very much for bearing with me as I got through so much material and so what felt like a little time to me. Although if you've been sitting and watching for 100 minutes, you probably feel like it took a very long time. I hope that it was pleasurable. I hope that it was helpful. Have a wonderful rest of the conference, and perhaps I'll see you at the Q&A. All right, goodbye, folks.